Hands up if you like experimental features. I certainly do. It makes me feel like I'm living life on the edge. And if you do too, then you are in luck, because that is the topic of choice for our next session. Taken to the stage for the CityJS 2021 conference is Beth from Southampton in the UK. Beth is a senior software engineer with Red Hat and also a Node.js member. In this talk, Beth is going to be taking you behind the scenes of the release pipeline for Node.js and shedding a little light on some of the experimental features that are in the pipeline, and also explaining how they make it into the stable release. If you have any questions for Beth on Node.js or anything else related to this talk, please join us for the Q&A session afterwards, and keep posting on social media using the hashtag CityJS2021, as well as keep those comments rolling in wherever you are watching. Beth, it is with pleasure, honor and privilege that I hand the stage over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Beth Griggs and I'm a senior software engineer at Red Hat. I gained my fedora not long ago when I moved over from IBM, and I'm excited to be here virtually at my second CityJS Conf. And today my talk is titled Node.js, New and Experimental Features. As part of my role at Red Hat, I help to maintain the Node.js runtime. I'm a Node.js Technical Steering Committee member, and I'm particularly active in the Node.js Release Working Group. So I'm often spending my time determining the content of and producing the releases of the Node runtime. And some of the other work I'm involved in at Red Hat includes contributing to some cloud development tooling, helping to build out a reference architecture for enterprise Node apps, and some advocacy work. And today I want to spend some time talking about how new features get into the hands of Node.js users, and why some features land as experimental first. In the latter half, I'll touch upon a few of the new recent experimental features in the more recent versions of Node.js. So Node.js is an impact project under the OpenJS Foundation. Formerly, the project was under the Node.js Foundation, but the project moved under OpenJS when the JS and Node foundations merged back in 2019. And the OpenJS Foundation is a neutral home for around 30 JavaScript projects, from the likes of jQuery, Electron, Node-RED, and others. And you may be surprised to learn that the Node project doesn't actually have a formal roadmap. There's no prioritized task lists, no single corporate sponsor, and the project is completely decentralized. And generally, the features that make it into the runtime are just the sum of the interest and requirements of the contributors writing them. So what's it like not having a roadmap? Well, I spent a short while trying to come up with a good analogy, and I thought this one was appropriate. I tried to stay topical for this conference too. So this is a famous roundabout or turning circle in the UK, and it's made of like 5 miniature roundabouts arranged in a circle. So it's really quite complicated to navigate at first. But as you can see, it handles a heavy flow of traffic heading in all different directions. Some cars are heading in the same direction, some aren't. And occasionally the traffic crosses paths and has to wait. And I think that somewhat represents the feature development of Node.js. There are a lot of contributors, a high amount of activity. Some folks are heading in a similar direction, and some folks are just working on their distinct parts of the project. And inevitably, sometimes things get held up when folks cross paths. And that could be for technical reasons, or maybe consensus needs to be gathered on some implementation details. But the main takeaway is there's a heavy activity flow, and folks are moving in numerous directions. So it's not always obvious to see what's coming next. So how can you find out what's in the pipeline? Well, there are a few ways you can try and keep track of what's happening in the project. So the Node.js project has an official Medium blog that you can check out. It's nodejs.medium.com. Twitter's another good way, following a bunch of the Node.js contributors on Twitter. They often share what they're working on. There are a number of folks at this conference speaking, and that would be good to follow to keep up to date. And you could also subscribe to the GitHub repository and follow GitHub notifications. But about those, P1, there's a lot of activity. It's really hard to keep up with these hundreds of notifications per day. Admittedly, I myself declare notification bankruptcy every week or so and just mark everything it's done and really rely on like the participating feed to keep track of what I need to respond to and address. So rather than trying to keep up with the massive notifications, there are some other efforts you can follow in particular. So despite having no roadmap, there's still longer term efforts and planning that you can follow. For example, we have working groups and teams dedicated to certain areas of the project. And these groups act as task forces for pushing forward certain subject areas forward. There is a distinction between a working group and a team. And the main distinction is that working groups are chartered and they are delegated responsibilities. So when you look at these, they own that area of the project and make the decisions. Whereas teams are just groups of folks who have an interest in that area that are invested in pushing them forwards. For example, in the past, we had the modules effort, which was really focused on driving the ECMAScript modules implementation forward. And as you can see, we've got a number of these at the moment. We've got diagnostics, Docker, the release working group, which I'm part of, and the package maintenance working group, among others. And just as a note, if you are looking to get involved in a project, one good way to do so is to look at joining one of these work groups or teams that aligns with your interests and checking out their GitHub repository. They all tend to have GitHub repositories with tasks and live stream meetings, and going along to some of these working group sessions or team sessions is a really good way of starting to get involved in the project. And as well as working groups and teams, we also have what we call strategic initiatives. And these are agreed initiatives that the project hopes to make progress on. Again, there's not really a priority list or deadline. There's still no roadmap, but these are just things we have listed as important goals. We think it'd be useful to monitor the status on it over time. And we also aim for each of these initiatives to have a champion that can be the kind of like focal point to push these forward and update on the status in our kind of weekly TSC meetings. And at the moment, our technical initiatives include promissifying the core APIs, V8 currency, so keeping up with the V8 updates that come in, quick and HTTP-free, startup performance, build resources, and a future of the build toolchain. As well as some of the technical strategic initiatives, we also have some community-focused initiatives under the community committee. And these include things like internationalization, mentorship, among others like the website redesign and outreach. Again, these are good areas and groups to look at getting involved with if you want to start participating in the project. And one effort I'd like to call out in particular is the Next 10 effort. So this team came together last year after one of our collaborative summits where we all get together to work on our kind of plan for the next year. And it's really around, this effort's really around trying to make the next 10 years of Node.js as successful as the last. So what we started by doing is looking back over the past 10 years, noting down what we thought went well, what led to the value of Node.js and led to the success. And from that, we tried to extract the core values and constituencies of the project itself. And by defining these, we hoped that we could use them as a lens to guide future development. So when we're reviewing a PR, always asking ourselves, we think developer experience is a priority. Is this PR aligning with those priorities we've listed here? And it would also help us identify which features would bring the most value to our Node.js users. And if you'd like to have your say in the next 10 years of Node.js, the project has just recently opened a user survey related to these next 10 efforts. So having defined some of our values and constituencies, we're now opening this up to our users so they can share their feedback, their values, and their requirements so that we can determine whether they align with what we've got so far. So it's your chance as a user to indicate what's important for you from the Node runtime in the next 10 years. You should be able to find the survey on Twitter, on the Node.js Twitter account. There are some ways of keeping up to date with the project. It's typically our users only find out about the new features when they get into their hands for a new release of Node. And there's a distinct flow in which you can expect new features to arrive in Node.js releases. Node.js has a predictable release schedule. We have 2 major releases per year, with the even-numbered release lines being promoted to long-term support. And within that schedule, we have 3 defined release phases: current, active long-term support, and maintenance. During the current phase, the release line will pick up most of the non-major or non-breaking changes that land on the Node core branch. In active LTS, only the new features, fixes, and updates that have been audited by the long-term support team will be brought into that release line. And for maintenance, that tends to be restricted to critical bug fixes and security updates. There are normally a few exceptions to this. Like, for example, we may decide to backport a feature into a maintenance release line if it's going to support people's migration path. So you can expect to pick up the newest features first in the current release line, which at the moment is Node.js 15. And typically for current, you can expect 1 release every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks, you should get an update of all the new features. After some time, some of the new features may be brought back into the long-term support release lines, but not all features will make it. Some will be considered too unstable to go back, and sometimes the delta in the release lines is just too large that it would take a lot of effort to bring back the feature. And if you're ever curious when the next release is, the release working group maintains some draft schedules in their repository. These are subject to change depending on releaser availability. As you may know, the project's very volunteer-based. There's a few folks like myself that have a small portion of their time sponsored by their employer to work on the project. So these schedules can slip just depending on our availability. And sometimes we also have to accommodate the ad hoc security releases, which can push the schedule down. And you can find the timeline and the individual schedules in the release working group repository, which is node.js/release. That's a bit about how you can follow what's coming next and how the features end up in the various release lines. How do you know when a feature is safe to use in your production applications? Well, Node.js provides a stability index. Throughout the API documentation, there are indicators of stability for each API. Presently, there are 3 stability levels: deprecated, experimental, and stable. And typically, we tend to only advise you to use stable features in production applications and to use experimental ones with caution. And there is an open proposal at the moment, maybe coming soon, to add an additional legacy stability. But you'll see more info on that when it's released. And just to recap through these stabilities. So for the deprecated stability, an API can be either documentation or runtime deprecated. And as you can expect, a document deprecation is an indication in the API docs that a given API is in a deprecated state. And this is just an example of socket buffer size deprecation. We can see it has an ID, deprecation ID, and also lists which version introduced the deprecation. And doc deprecations can land in minor releases of Node.js. And because documentation deprecations are just that, written in documentation, it can be difficult to keep up with these and follow what's been deprecated. So Node.js does provide a pending deprecation process flag. So some documentation-only deprecations will trigger a warning when you launch it with this flag. So you'd maybe use this just to occasionally to check whether any APIs you're using in your script or application are documentation deprecated, just so you can get the visibility and maybe it's going to be deprecated. And then we have runtime deprecations. So by default, these will generate a process warning that will be printed to standard error the first time the deprecated API is used. And the unhandled promise rejection warning you may be familiar with. And in case you missed it, this warning will now throw by default in Node 15 onwards. And because runtime deprecations are observable changes and they could break people who are relying on the standard error output, you should only experience new runtime deprecations when you're upgrading new major versions. Again, there might be some occasional exceptions, but generally that should be the case. And there are a few other process-related flags. So you have no deprecations to silence all deprecation warnings, but of course you should be cautious doing this because you're just silencing a problem that might need to be fixed. essentially kicking it down the road because a deprecated API may actually be removed in future. And then we have the throw deprecation. So this takes the more extreme approach of throwing whenever a deprecation is seen. So for experimental features. So the Node project stability index states that experimental APIs may change in behavior. So the traditional semantic versioning contract that we typically adhere to doesn't apply here, even in the long-term supported release lines. And this is why we say to use them with caution, because the API may change, even in long-term support. And why do some features land as experimental and others do not? Well, in some cases, the most suitable API design may not be agreed upon up front. And we may want to get almost a draft of the feature out there so we can receive user feedback and evolve the API accordingly. Essentially, it's in the cases we don't want to lock in the API too soon. And there are a number of whole core modules in Node.js that are still designated as experimental. And when I say core modules, I'm referring to the ones built into the runtime, so FS, HTTP. And all of these are experimental as of Node.js 15.12.0, which was released just last week. So the first experimental module we have is the async hooks module. The async hooks module provides an API to track asynchronous resources. What do I mean by async resources? These are things like promises, timeouts, immediates, ticks, and the like. And in particular, I'd like to call out the async local storage class. This class is used to create a synchronous state within callbacks and promise change. And this example simulates how it might be used within a web server. So you initialize the async local storage, and then within our server handler, our request handler, we call the async local storage run. And this creates a kind of like async local context for each flow, so that within our log request with ID function, we can call the async local storage get store, and that will be able to pull out the ID of the request. The get store is specific to the async flow. The orders are relevant. It will get the right one for the context it's in. And this feature is particularly useful for things like application performance monitors. Things like that. And there are very recent discussions happening about bringing the async local storage class out of experimental and into stable. And another experimental core module we have is the diagnostics channel module. The diagnostics channel module provides an API to create named channels to report message data for diagnostic purposes. So the intention is that you will create numerous channels to report messages through, and then you can subscribe to receive the messages. So what's the kind of use case for this? Well, you can imagine you create a channel for all of your SQL queries that you could publish all of your queries to, and then subscribe to that. So it's a diagnostic tool similar to how you log. And then we have the experimental inspector module. And as the name suggests, this module provides an API for interacting with the V8 inspector. In this example, we're using the inspector module to interact with the inspector programmatically to profile CPU. And as you can see, we use this by requiring the module, initializing an inspector session, enabling and starting the profiler. Then we run the task that we wish to measure. And then we stop the profiler and maybe write the output to a file that we can use later. And in a similar vein, we have the experimental trace events module. Again, this module provides a mechanism to centralize tracing information that's generated by V8, Node Core, or even your own code. And similarly, it's a case of importing the module, enabling the tracing, running the task you wish to measure, and then disabling. And this will produce some trace log files that can be viewed in the Chrome tracing utility. And then the final experimental core module we have at the moment is the WebAssembly System Interface core module. This is an experimental implementation of the WebAssembly System Interface spec, and it gives applications, WebAssembly applications to the underlying operating system. So that's some of the experimental core modules, but we also have some notable individual APIs that are still designated as experimental. And so as you may know, the Node.js ECMAScript modules implementation is now stable in Node.js 15. And it's actually soon due to be marked stable in Node.js 14 and 12 too. The PRs are open, so hopefully they should be out soon. A few of the specific APIs within the ECMAScript module implementation are still experimental. And this includes the loaders API. So you'd use the loaders API to customize the default module resolution via some loader hooks that you can provide. And for this, you'd have to run with the experimental loader flag, pass your custom loader implementation, and then pass your module file. And this will only customize the ESM module loading. It won't apply to any common JS modules. And then another one we have is JSON modules. So currently importing JSON modules is only supported in CommonJS, but we do have the experimental form of importing JSON in ESM. And I think this will be experimental for a little while longer. There's still some ongoing discussions about when we can bring it out of experimental. And there are alternatives that can be used at the moment. So for example, the module create require API. So this one may take a little while longer. And in a similar vein, we have the WASM modules. So again, this is importing WASM modules. And that's in line with the ES module proposal for WebAssembly. And one of the most anticipated recent features is top-level await. And this allows you to use await at the top level, i.e. outside an async function. And this is per the ECMAScript top-level await proposal that went through TC39. So within ECMAScript modules only, you can await resources, which means that the other modules that import them will have to wait on these tasks before they start evaluating the body. And what are the use cases for this? Well, these examples were taken from the TC39 proposal. You may use it to import a resource based on a dynamic value or dynamic path. You may use it for resource initialization, so for like waiting for a DB connector, or dependency fallbacks. So you try to import one resource, and if that fails, you import another. And then we have policies. This is another experimental API. They're a security feature that provide guarantees about what code Node.js is able to load. So you'd create a policy manifest to enforce constraints. And then when you run, this implementation would check against the constraints you've included in your policy file. So in this one, we've just got the integrity, which is inspired by the browser security mechanism to enforce resource integrity. And this has been in core for a couple of years now in experimental. And then we have promise-fied timers. So this API provides an alternate set of timer functions that return promise objects. So you'd import timers / promises, and means you can await things like set timeout without using the promise-fied utility. And then we have a large number of other experimental APIs throughout the various core modules within the runtime. And they include buffer blob, the capture rejections and events, some module-related experimental APIs in the VM module. We have the Web Crypto API, and we also have the broadcast channel in workers as experimental. And a number of these experimental features we've talked about are actually hidden behind process flags. And this is to make them opt-in. To use some of these features, you will need to actually start your Node.js process with a corresponding flag to enable the feature. For example, the -- experimental top-level await flag to enable top-level await. At some point, the features may be unflagged, and confusingly, this may or may not coincide with them being marked stable. So at some point, you can expect some of these features to be available by default, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be stable. And then we have some very, very experimental features, and these are hidden behind build time flags. And to use these, you'd have to compile Node.js yourself from source, so clone the Node.js repository, configure, ensure you've got the relevant compilers, and then build Node yourself. And why do we do this? We do this predominantly in cases where we want to start working on the implementation of a new feature and get it regularly built and tested in our CI environment without it yet being released publicly. And we tend to do this in cases where a lot of change is expected in the feature and it's going to be just too unstable for general use. And finally, we have some stable features. For stable features, semantic versioning applies. You can have confidence that we'll try to keep to the API contract. We do a lot of module ecosystem testing. So when we release a new version of Node.js, we have a tool called Stitchin, which will include around 100 of the common modules. And if any of them break between the upgrade between the old version and the new version, we use that as input to see what the consequences on the ecosystem changes we're making in the runtime are. But generally, you should only experience breaking API changes at the next major version, because we do try to adhere to semantic versioning contracts. There are rare exceptions. For example, if a security issue kind of ties our hands and we have to make a breaking API change just to resolve that security hole. But this is like the exception. We only do it where absolutely necessary. And how do features graduate from experimental to stable? Well, it's really when the contributors most involved in the feature have confidence in the API and don't believe major overhauls of the feature are likely. And how can we get there quicker? Well, it's really around user feedback. The more user feedback we receive on an experimental feature, the quicker we can gain confidence and consensus in the API structure. Some APIs may end up being removed completely, having never made it out of experimental. And this is, again, part of the reason why we suggest using experimental features with caution, because there's no guarantees that they're going to be made stable. They may end up being removed. But again, it's kind of like catch-22. Some folks won't want to start using them because they're not sure whether they're going to remain. But nonetheless, it's good to play with these experimental features and give us feedback, because that really drives us forward with moving them to stable. And there are a number of other new stable features in the latest release line. For example, the abort controller implementation. So this is to provide cancellation and aborting on some promise-based APIs. And there's ongoing efforts at the moment to incorporate this into more of the runtime APIs. And Node 15 comes with NPM 7. And one of the features I quite like in NPM 7 is the NPM diff, which you can point to. You can compare two versions of a package to see what the content changes between them, and it shows it in kind of a Git patch-like form. So that's quite a cool feature in NPM 7, and we have source map support. So source maps provide a method for translating the generated source back to the original, and this is really useful to tackle some of the challenges with observability when folks are using alternative flavors of JavaScript like TypeScript and similar. And then we have V8 9.0, and it's via our V8 updates that we tend to pick up the new JavaScript language features. And you may know that the recent versions of V8 brought optional chaining to Node.js 15. And in V8 9, we got the regex match indices. And this provides an indices array to get the start and end positions of each match captured group for a regular expression. So Node.js 16 is coming soon, in case you've not been following. 20th of April 2021 will be the release. And as it's an even numbered release line, it will be promoted to long-term support in October. And there are release candidates out already. You may be able to find one on my Twitter, or maybe the Foundation account can tweet it out. So please feel free to test out the candidate and provide feedback. And you can expect a release announcement from the Node.js and OpenJS Foundation to coincide with the release. And just as another reminder, at this point, Node.js 10 will go end of life in April, so out with the old, in with the new kind of thing. So any folks who are still on Node 10, after April, there will be no more security fixes, no more critical updates. So start planning your migration if you haven't already. So If you're interested, I'd like to encourage everyone to take a look, try out, provide feedback on some of the experimental features. Be cool to build some apps with them. Maybe don't rush into using them in your critical applications just yet. And I'd also like to remind folks to have their say in the next 10 survey, because we'd really appreciate your feedback. It helps us figure out what features should go into the next versions of Node. And with that, I'd like to wish you all an enjoyable rest of the conference and look forward to joining you all in the Q&A. And hopefully I'll be able to share some of these links out there.
Wow, Bethany, that was a brilliant talk. Thank you very much for delivering it today and for sharing some insights into the things that are landing in Node.js over the coming months, years, and possibly even decades. After all, you never know how long these committees are going to take to put something into the specifications. I'm sure we won't have to wait until the 2030s for the next batch of features. Please join me in giving Bethany a huge round the world round of applause. Now, if you watched that talk and you thought, I wish that this feature or that feature would land in Node.js, why not let us know using the hashtag CityJS2021 on Twitter, pop something in the comments on YouTube, or better yet, why not join our Q&A, which will be hosted on GatherTown any moment now, and you'll get to pose your questions to Bethany for some answers. Hopefully, I'll see you there. If not, see you shortly for the next talk.
I do love that little point he does behind the scenes. He looks so authoritative. Beth, thank you very much for an amazing talk. I think we need a second round the world round of applause for you, except it's just around my little studio today, not around the world. But thank you very much. Very insightful look at what's coming for Node.js. But I kind of want to kick us off with a bit of a left field question, if that's okay. So you spoke about experimental features. You spoke about extremely experimental features as well as stable features. What I want to know is if you had carte blanche to do anything you wanted with Node.js and you didn't have to worry about past versions or maintaining usability and allowing people to keep using it without changing too much, what would you introduce into Node.js?
That's a tough one to think about. I definitely think alignment with the web and the browser is definitely a priority, just because that's going to benefit so many folks, not having to learn the gotchas between what happens in the browser and what happens when they're writing backend code with Node. So yeah, that's quite a wide answer, but yeah, just focusing on the alignment with the web browser just to make folks' lives easier. And I think it would improve the developer experience without people having to jump between the two with too much difficulty.
Yeah, because there's so much similarities in front end and back end JavaScript. I mean, it's JavaScript, right? But yeah, those APIs can catch you out sometimes, I guess. Excellent. So we've got one from Pedro, which is my favorite name in the world, by the way, Pedro. Thank you. Performance-wise, is there a big change from V14 to V16?
Good question. I don't think we've run our benchmarks yet. We do have some on particular pull requests that we think may cause some performance implications. We do run our benchmarks on those to try and gate it at the point it lands in the main branch. But the new V8 update only landed, I think, last week or the week before. And I think we tend to get a lot of improvements or a lot of change in performance from those. So I don't know yet, but that's a good idea to run the benchmarks. I'll give those a go and see what they spit out.
I love the fact that you do not know yet. That's how cutting edge we are here at CityJS. We don't even know what the performance implications are. Fantastic. I have a follow-on question. It's not one that's come from the audience, but I was chatting with one of my mentees not too long ago about Node.js, and we were wondering why it's only the even number versions that stick in our head. We don't remember 7, 9, 11, 13. Could you tell us just really briefly about that number versioning for my sake more than anyone else's?
Yeah, so when just after the OJS and Node.js projects merged together again, the Node project established a long-term support policy, and it was just part of that policy it defined that the odd numbered ones would never be graduated to long-term support. So even numbered ones always get promoted to long-term support. I think this is a trend seen in a lot of other projects. They tend to have their own schemes, not always odd even, but they just designate certain versions. So the reason they probably stick in your head more is because they're supported for much longer. So there's around 30 months that you'll see like Node 10 around, but Node 9, the odd numbered ones, they only actually exist for around 6 to 8 months. So Node 15 was released in October, and it will be out of support by May, June time. So it's generally the period of time that they're supported.
Well, that makes perfect sense. So if anybody watching this is planning to do a tutorial series on Node.js things, pick an even number.
Yeah, for sure.
Fantastic. And I'm sure there are quite a few in the audience. So we've had a question from Andre coming in, and he's looking at the deprecated APIs page of Node.js, just for a little bit of context. He says it seems to be an all or nothing approach to throw deprecation, and I'd also assume no deprecation. Would it be possible to escalate/silence only some of the deprecated APIs, but not the others?
Yeah, so I think not all of the documentation deprecated ones actually have the implementation. That means they will spit out a warning when we run it with the no, the throw and no. Yeah, not really sure on that one because how to answer that one, because not all of them trigger these warnings by default. So yeah, there is a heavy reliance, unfortunately, on looking at the deprecations page and figuring out the state, even though some of those flags help you to answer that question. Unfortunately, it's going to rely on like change logs and checking out the docs on a lot of these too. There is a proposal at the moment to add another state, which is a legacy state proposed by James now. And this would be another state in our stability matrix that we would mark things as legacy. But I believe the intent is that even though it's legacy, it's not going to be removed. So maybe that would help with the understanding, like this API, we discourage use, but will never be removed. And then we have deprecated saying this is deprecated and will likely be removed. So yeah, there's definitely more work to do around how we explain these stabilities and deprecations.
I mean, to be honest, I think encouraging developers to look at the documentation more in order to find those might not actually be a bad thing.
Yeah, and I guess on our side, trying to pull these out in our change logs a bit more and highlights like the top of every change log saying this is what's been deprecated should help as well.
Yeah, that would be useful. That would definitely be useful. Definitely. So I'm going to throw back to the last conference, and you're probably sick of talking about Dino because it's the hot new thing. But last time we had a Q&A session, I asked you whether the Node team were scared of Dino taking over the market share. I think I'm going to flip that question around now and ask, is there any learnings that you as a team are planning to take or want to take from Dino and implement in Node.js? Because it is taking a different route with a few different aspects.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely I think it's great that there's another runtime because like especially where there are benefits that they don't have the stability that Node.js tries to kind of enforce. They don't have the history. They can start from a clean slate a bit more than we can, so to speak. So it's interesting to see what people like about Dino, what use cases are actually being used by folks using Dino for their like production grade applications. And I do think we are learning from Dino, and hopefully Dino's learning from what's happening in the Node project too. Particularly around security, so like the security enabling like access to FS and the security features that Dino provides. I do think there are some learnings. I think it goes both ways. There's inspiration from the Node side to Dino, and to us around which new features are taking off in each of the platforms.
Okay, so it is turning into more of a collaboration than a competition, even if it's off the record and off the books.
Yeah, it's just like figuring out like users of JavaScript and people building the kinds of tools they build with Node, and what they're needing from a platform, and if having more runtimes helps us figure that out.
Perfect. I've got a completely different question. That was the perfect answer, by the way. I've got a completely different question now. And it's one that I'm probably not going to ask too many people, but you've got such an amazing background. I really, really like it. And I want to get it for this wall. Where did you get your wallpaper from?
It came from a B&Q DIY, like Home Depot equivalent in the UK.
Okay.
Yeah, it's wallpaper. It's real. It's not fake. It's not AI or anything. So.
Awesome. Right, I'm getting on B&Q ordering after this. Maybe we'll see it appear over the next couple of days. So we'll wrap up. We've only got another minute, but I've got a couple of rapid fire questions for you. And we're asking these to everybody. We just want to see what the lay of the land is. So the first rapid fire question: tabs or spaces?
Tabs.
Oh, never mind. Front end or back end?
Back end.
That doesn't surprise me. TypeScript or JavaScript?
JavaScript.
Okay. Chrome or Safari or Firefox?
Chrome.
Chrome. Okay. And finally, apples or bananas?
Apples, I think. Go with apples, yeah.
Apples. Everyone's gone with apples. I thought it would be bananas. Never mind. Beth, it has been a pleasure talking to you once again. Hopefully you have a fantastic year, and thank you for giving this amazing talk at this year's conference.
Ooh, thanks, everyone.
Fingers crossed we'll get to be together in September for the in-person event. Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. And to everybody watching along, we'll be starting our next talk very, very shortly.